History as it happens, January 30th, 2024. Fascists everywhere.
We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated.
Let's have trial by combat.
We had a crazy, delusional, authoritarian, dangerous, criminal president of the United States.
Weird moment in American news and politics right now, where half the country is shouting about how the Republican presidential nominee keeps quoting those dictators.
Ко всем гражданам России. Благодарю вас за выдержку, сплоченность.
Close ally of the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has resigned, comparing his recent comments on race to the Nazi era. Mr. Orbán had described Western Europe as a mixed-race world, saying Hungarians should only mix with other Europeans.
城的钢铁长城面前，碰得头破血流。
What is going on in the world right now? Dictators and demagogues are dominating headlines as they rule powerful countries, wage war, vilify the other, and rankle the establishment. Some historians say many of today's strongmen are fascists, and fascism is on the rise, even in America. But maybe we need a new vocabulary for today's crisis. And that's next with Roger Griffin as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
You can see serious attempts to move democracy to an authoritarian position, to have a command economy, to actually undermine liberal democratic values, etc. And some would argue that what we saw on the 6th of January a couple of years ago was an actual sort of attempted fascist coup, and some people argue that quite seriously. But I think the main problem is fascism as a word is so extraordinarily unhelpful because it's what is known in semiotics as a floating signifier. It can move around in different contexts and take on different connotations.
Oh, this again. Wait a second. Cut the audio. All right, we are talking about fascism again. But let's try to not think about Hitler for a moment. The Nazis were unique. They were just one fascist movement that was last in power in 1945. Most fascist movements never reach power. Fascism, as our guest today defines it, is a political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Palingenetic means notions of national rebirth, to reach back in time to locate the mythical nation that existed before the ravages of modernity, and then to look ahead to a reborn national community, free of the decadence and weakness that caused the old rot, a new America, a new Russia, if you will. Does this definition help us understand Trump or Putin or Orbán or Modi or Xi or the Ayatollahs in Iran or any of the authoritarians or wannabe dictators strutting around the world stage nowadays? I don't think it does, but maybe you subscribe to a different definition of fascism or a new one, fit for the 21st century rather than the 1930s. In his book, The Anatomy of Fascism, the historian Robert Paxton puts off defining the word until page 218 when it's no longer possible to avoid it. Paxton writes about this very elastic term that fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. So that's another definition of fascism to consider, as here we are, another episode dedicated to this ideology. Or to borrow the title of an essay written by historian Rick Perlstein for the American Prospect, we're here to understand American fascism, with Donald Trump apparently starring as the American fascist. I think we need a new vocabulary to understand today's crisis of liberalism and the so-called rise of the autocrats. So that is why I invited Roger Griffin to return to the podcast. he of the palingenetic definition, the professor emeritus of history at Oxford Brookes University and author of Fascism, A Total Immersion, and Fascism, An Introduction to Comparative Fascist Studies. Roger Griffin, hello.
Yeah, well, it's good to be back. I've a lot of things been happening in the world and in my own life since we last talked.
Well, I love having you on. You're one of my favorite guests in the 300 or so episodes I've done. Did you notice that last year the Oxford word of the year was Rizz, R-I-Z-Z, which is a colloquial noun defined as style, charm, or attractiveness, the ability to attract a romantic or sexual partner. However, my nominee for word of the year was palingenesis.
Yeah, well, we're working on that, okay?
Whenever I use that word in a sentence, people look at me like I have three heads.
It needs to get a short form because Riz comes from charismatic, and it's a bit like flu for influenza. It's chopped off the infix and the suffix, so you just get flu. You can't really do that very well with palingenesis. I mean, it is a very off-putting word.
It means rebirth, right? Yeah,
it means rebirth. Yeah.
Well, that is relevant to what we're about to discuss here. Because,
absolutely.
So many definitions of fascism are being thrown around that don't include, well, what you say is essential to understanding fascism. So why don't we just start off broadly here? It is often observed that we're living at an inflection point right now with the rising autocrats challenging the post-1945 order, or maybe the post-1991 order. The USSR is gone. Democracy is in retreat. China is rising. We have Trump and Putin, Orban, and others. And some people are rummaging around in the 1930s to figure out what's going on here, that we're seeing creeping fascism in the United States. What's your big picture take on all of that?
Before Christmas, I was invited to Helsinki to a prestigious academic institution to discuss with some pretty high-powered political theorists and historians what we can learn from history and whether there are concepts floating around and, in particular, actual political and historical events which can be drawn on to illuminate what's going on in the world now. And of course, one of the things they focused on, quite serious thinkers, not just journalists, who actually see a deep structural parallel between the interwar period in Europe and the global situation. And the analogy would be in terms of a general sense of crisis of civilization, the loss of faith in liberal democracy as the basic template for all nations and the basis of progress, and the rise of autocrats, whether it's Stalin or Hitler or Mussolini, dominating historical events, and then a sort of battle between democracy as the West saw it, and first of all, Nazism, fascism, then, of course, totalitarian socialism. And the misleadingly optimistic short-term outcome of that was the early 1990s, where you get the end of history and the triumph of liberal democracy. And then now that triumph now looks like a complete misreading of where we all were in 1990s. So we're back to analogies with the interwar period. And if there were genuine, deep structural analogies with the interwar period, then throwing around the word fascism wouldn't be quite so bad. The general consensus of the meeting in Helsinki was that actually, let's get back to basics. All historical events are unique. So we're dealing with unfolding patterns of happenings. And the urge of the human mind is to see patterns and to make sense. And all the way through history, in the Renaissance period, people were desperately trying to make sense of what was going on in, say, 16th, 17th century Italy through the classics, through Greek and Roman classic. So, for example, you get Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Why would some guy study the end of the Roman Empire? Because there were analogies with the feeling of the end of the world in the 16th and 17th century. And before that, of course, for nearly 1,500 years, it was the Bible that everybody went to in Christendom to try and find archetypes. And now people in the West are trying to find archetypes within their own history.
Yeah.
And the thing about aphorisms and analogies, that they should be the starting point for thinking and insight, not the end point. The bottom line can never be that Trump is a fascist or that we're living through a new Weimar. What I really like about Socrates, who I've never read, but this is my sort of bluffer's guide, is that he believed in arriving at some sort of deeper truth. He also said that he knew nothing, which was an advance on people who think they know, is that you start with one position which you deconstruct and challenge to a point where you actually gain deeper insight. Now, I think to start with the idea that there is an analogy between where the West is and the world is now in the 2020s and the 1920s and 1930s, that's a pretty good starting point, where we look at economic, and now we can add ecological and deep political, ideological upheavals, which throw up forms of autocracy, which wipe out what then comes to look like extremely fragile democracies and old regime type things. And there are some interesting parallels there, but the differences are so profound. If you do it Socratically, you quickly move on to starting to realize just how different these things are.
Yeah.
I mean, same sort of thing happened with COVID, that they thought, is this a SARS? Is this a respiratory thing? What's it like? And that's where you start, but you can never end there because everything is unique, including viruses.
Yeah, well, it is challenging at any given time to understand what is going on in the world around you. It's very difficult. It takes time. That's why we have historians. But as people, we feel a need, right, to try to make sense of the world. So we look back into history, and maybe some of these things seem convincing, as you say, at a surface level. Maybe it helps us feel better that we've now got our minds wrapped around our problems and now we can start searching for solutions. But I think I'm with you. The 1930s are not a great place here for one reason above all else. We're not seeing a fascist movement in the United States or in Russia. Do you agree with that?
Well, a lot of really quite influential political commentators and American journalists and the writers of some quite heavy books like Albright would disagree with you, that we are seeing a form of American fascism, and that has its own, if you look back at American history of the 20th century through that prism, you can see serious attempts to move democracy to an authoritarian position, to have a command economy, to actually undermine liberal democratic values, etc. And some would argue that what we saw on the 6th of January a couple of years ago was an actual sort of attempted fascist coup. And some people argue that quite seriously.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
But I think the main problem is fascism as a word is so extraordinarily unhelpful because it's what is known in semiotics as a floating signifier. It can move around in different contexts and take on different connotations. It was used under Stalin to discredit other factions within communism. It was used in Chinese communism between factions to discredit each other. It was used by the Communist Party under Weimar to discredit the Social Democrats that they called social fascists. The socialists created an entire fairly coherent critique of fascism as a child of capitalism, which created a vast and very impressive literature. But that's not very helpful because I don't think many commentators use this. I mean, some movements do, but in America, but most journalists are coming from a liberal capitalist position, if you like. But my main problem is that there has grown up a really productive academic discipline called fascist studies. And it seems to me that most people who think they are qualified to talk about the putative fascism in America feel as if they don't have to do any homework, whatever their background, to actually mug up on, like for an exam, where fascist studies are now. I mean, some of them, when they were younger, before the 90s, there really was no consensus within academia about what fascism was. But there really is now. And now it is possible, if you did, for example, a doctorate now, if you went to any Western-oriented university, Australia, Singapore, whatever, and wanted to do it, or Japan, and wanted to do a doctorate on fascism, you would have to engage with the literature that has grown up, which defines fascism very specifically as a revolutionary political and cultural ideology. And if you break that down, that means it is not enough just to be an authoritarian republican within a constitutional system. It's not enough for Putin to make himself basically a president for life within what really is a travesty of a constitutional system, but it's still technically it's as if the Weimar Republic had never been abolished in the way that Hitler did so radically, or the liberal regime in Italy had never been abolished by Mussolini. He just carried on being head of state. But what he did very specifically in January 1925 was to create a new order. And until academics see the proof, which I think is disproved on the 6th of January, the intent on the part of the future autocrat to actually create a new and sustainable alternative modern political order, academics would not agree with the use of this word in a phrase like American fascism or Trumpian fascism. They would see this as a colloquialism or a slur word or a pejorative term, but deeply unhelpful in coming to grips with what Trumpism actually is.
Yeah, so fascism does share commonalities with other forms, political ideology that are unpleasant, let's put it that way. But in order to be a fascist, Roger Griffin, you are saying that you have to want to create a new order. And let's talk about that great word I mentioned, palingenesis. There has to be some kind of rebirth myth there. So you're looking to the past at the mythical nation that existed prior to modernity, and you want to try to restore, it's not conservative, but you want to restore that in a revolutionary manner. Explain that.
Yeah.
And you're saying that Trump does not, this is not what Trump is after.
You see, the crucial thing, if you actually look at genuine fascists, and I mean, there were a lot of them in the interwar period, who wrote a lot. They were ideologues. I mean, not all of them were ideologues. But if you read Oswald Mosley in Britain, or if you read Codreanu in Romania, or if you read Shalasi in Hungary, they wrote things. We're not just speculating here. They were extremely specific that they were convinced they were living through a radical crisis of civilization. If you want to stick a name on that, you can talk about Spengler, the decline of the West. The Western system is collapsing. The Western system is the Enlightenment, liberal, democratic, capitalist order as it stands. Individualism, private enterprise, the privatization of life, a society made up of individuals, the wealth of nations, enterprise being a whole lot of the aggregate of lots of individual decisions of people to pursue their own business and their own interests, and that somehow forms a society. So the First World War, they were blissfully ignorant of an ecological crisis, but the First World War wasn't just a military and human catastrophe. It was a marker of a turning point. You talked about, what was that phrase? A point of inflection.
Point,
yeah. Well, the Germans have the word Zeitwende, which means turning point. Wende means turn and Zeit means time. But you also have in Hegel something like world historical moment. If you think in terms of, for example, the transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament, if you watch the film Ben-Hur, that's what that's all about. If you have these moments, say, in Michelangelo's paintings, where suddenly there's a new concept of what human beings are, fascists were convinced that they were riding a wave. They were historical surfers, and they were on a breaking wave, and that this wave would carry humanity, guided by fascist movements and violence, into this new era, which would be different in not just in ethos, but in the very nature of human beings. I mean, fascists were obsessed with an anthropological revolution, a cultural revolution. They had a plan to actually regenerate human beings, which under liberal democracy were becoming weak and introspective and self-seeking, etc. I see nothing of this, either in Putin or in Trump You could look more interestingly at Modi, for example, who says he opened this temple last week in Ayodhya, very symbolically, and he actually said, India is a Hindu nation. Well, if you carried that through in a multicultural, multi-faith India now, with the venom that the Nazis did and actually persecuted all the non-Hindus, you would have an absolute revolution. You know, people like Trump and Putin and Modi have worldviews which, if they were executed to their logical conclusion, would lead to megadeath. They would lead to concentration camps with homosexuals in and transgender people in, and the persecution and deportation of large sections of population. But they don't. They stay in power and they manipulate the constitution, but they want to stay in power and they want to make their country great again. But they are not coherent in some sort of vision of a new Russia or a new America or a new Turkey or a new India. They stay just on the cusp between a revolutionary new order and a deeply illiberal manipulation of the constitutional democracy. Yeah. And so that's why they're so difficult to classify, but that's also why they're so successful, because I don't think if Trump was a true thoroughgoing fascist that he would have a mass support. I don't think a great mass of Trumpists in America are actually fascists by temperament. They don't want a new America. They want America to be great again with all the nebulous ambiguity of that phrase, a nostalgia for a sort of American dream, white America, whatever. But this is not a revolutionary new order. There is no break with the past.
I agree. I don't see a systematic ideological doctrine underpinning either Trump or Putinism. But let's go back to what you said there. You said if they could. You mentioned, concentration camps. Obviously, Putin is anti-gay, anti-transgender. Some people here in the United States would say, well, that's why Trump actually is a fascist, because if he could get his way, if he was able to dismantle all the guardrails and all the institutional protections of democracy, we would be living in a dictatorship. How do you respond to that?
Well, you see, this is all posited on an idea. You see, I think one of the problems for political commentators in America is that most of them are quite sharp. They've probably done quite well at school. They're probably a bit nerdy. They read a lot. They think a lot. They like debate. They probably, like this podcast, is posited on a sort of pleasure, what the French call jouissance of interaction of ideas. Trump is mentally constitutionally incapable of serious engagement with any sort of political ideology. He literally can't be asked, we say in English. It's very clear from his so-called style of government that he is absolutely uninterested in the detail, in the paperwork, in the implications, in what it means, in coherence, in ideological coherence, in anything really. He's just improvising, bluffing. He's a con man. He's not even a very bright con man. I mean, I don't think his messaging is subtle. It's effective because he is actually at the level of his own propaganda. I mean, Hitler was a very, very bright guy. He had a propaganda minister called Goebbels, who had a doctorate in German literature, was a very bright guy. I mean, can you imagine creating a ministry called the Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda? I mean, he specifically sat down and said, how do we sell this message? What images, what posters, like an advertising agent? And in fact, the very word propaganda comes from a Vatican Council, which was set up to propagate the faith of Catholicism. They realized that actually Catholic faith is really complicated if you're a theologian. I mean, there's a lot of work in it, but you need a version of it for the ordinary people. I'm arguing that somebody like Trump isn't giving the people a simplified populist version of his worldview. That is his blooming worldview. He wants America to be great again. He wants to stop involvement in foreign wars, and he wants all manufacturing to be in America, and he doesn't want migrants messing it up or United Nations or foreign, because he wants a sort of pure, unencumbered, isolationist America getting on with this itself with a very simplistic idea of what it is to be America and a sort of hazy, vague nostalgia for a past he has no intellectual academic knowledge of at all. I bet if you put him in a school exam about American history, he knows absolutely nothing. compare with, say, Churchill or Roosevelt or any serious politician.
The Continental Army suffered a bitter winter of Valley Forge, found glory across the waters of the Delaware, and seized victory from Cornwallis of Yorktown. Our army manned the airport. It ran the ramparts. It took over the airports. It did everything it had to do. And at Fort McHenry, under the rocket's red glare, it had nothing but victory.
So I'm saying that there isn't a mask that he has put on to appeal to the people. In a way, his mask is a reflection of the level at which most people support him. And they are also very clearly not interested in legal or political or historical truth. They operate, his followers operate at a emotive level, which is very difficult for political journalists and people like you and me to actually get our heads around, because there's nothing there to get our head around.
Yeah, he does connect with people in a certain way, but as I've said on the show, if he were to change his position on every policy tomorrow at his next rally or whenever he's going to hold it, I don't think it would make much difference.
No, exactly. But my point is, he wouldn't even notice he was... I mean, he's a con man. He's a bluffer. What he realizes very deeply is, in a way, like that American who convinced big backers that she'd got a blood test that could diagnose any illness, and she got millions and millions of people backing it. Now, when I heard about what her offer was, I thought, this is obviously a con. When Trump offers Americans a chance for the country to be great again, in this sort of nebulous, undefined way, it's obviously a scam. But my point is, he has very deeply in his youth realized that in certain financial and social circumstances, you can get away with bluffing because some people like somebody with the arrogance and confidence to tell big stories about themselves, and they will not challenge them because that is where their charisma lies.
Yeah, it's like there's an awe there that anyone could go up there with that type of audacity and just say these things, right? Yeah. So, Roger, I want to bounce something off of you here. I shared with you an article in American Prospect that was written by the historian of the modern conservative movement, Rick Perlstein, who is writing about the work of John Gans, a historian and political scientist. He says here on the issue of political theory, Gans points out that a book that won a lot of respect for its explanatory power in the European context, Dylan Riley's The Civic Foundations of Fascism in Europe, has been deployed in the American context by critics of the idea that fascism is a relevant category here and now. Gans explains that Riley's theory is that in a society where the political establishment is weak and cannot get consensus behind it, but there is a highly developed civil society where there are a lot of pressure groups, you can expect something like fascism, and those groups make demands on the political system that it cannot satisfy. So these two fellows, Perlstein and Gans, are convinced that we're seeing some kind of an American brand of fascism, based in part on that we have these right-wing pressure groups that are making demands on our political establishment that cannot be satisfied.
There is no objective definition of fascism, and they are perfectly right. They have every legal and social and civic right to use the term any way they like. And if that helps them make sense of Trumpism, good for them. I don't object to them writing these things, but I question whether they actually know very much about what happened in the interwar period. What happened in the interwar period was that there was a massive economic crisis after the First World War, really complicated, but found out from America and the Great Crash, the Great Depression. In the case of some countries, it hit them extremely hard. And after a First World War, which had had a whole load of terrible economic, sociological and psychological effects, this massive collapse of the European economy in 1929 caused a polarization between communist left and rising nationalism, which saw liberal democracy as weak. And there were lobby groups, there were pressure groups on both the left and the right. Now, you don't have the equivalent of these pressure groups now on the left very much in Western society, but there are anguished nationalists all over the place who are trying to push civil society towards being harder on immigration, more isolationist, less prone to prop up international organizations, basically retreat from humanism, retreat from what I call liberal democracy. Now, one of the great slippages in usage that I've become a bit obsessed with, if you like, is the way there is a slippage between the word liberalism and the word democracy. So people say a crisis of liberalism, or they just talk about a crisis of democracy. And I want to go back to the fact that historically, liberal democracy is a binomial expression. It's got two terms, liberal and democracy. They are not the same. But when they are working in a compound, they create a new entity, a liberal democracy, because democracy in itself is not liberal, and liberalism in itself is not democratic. They have a natural, if you like, elective affinity to move towards each other. But you can very easily have a democracy without liberalism. And just to give you a rather dramatic example,
Hungary right now.
After Hitler got into power as chancellor, he suspended the Weimar Constitution with what was called the Enabling Act, the Ermächtigungsgesetz, after the Reichstag fire. And technically, the rest of the war was run legally under a suspended constitution. So if you think of democracy just as a constitution with rules and judiciary, etc., you can very easily have a constitution which rides slipshod over human rights and arrests people and allows a massive poverty to emerge and blah, 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 without any of the you can have a democracy without liberalism.
Yeah, well, the Soviet Union had a constitution that had a lot of nice words in it, but it was not a liberal place.
Well, Putin's Russia is technically a liberal democracy. It has regular elections and it has representative bodies, and on paper it has a separation of powers. It has all that stuff. So you can have a democracy very easily without liberalism. And you can also have, in the 19th century in Britain, you had liberalism as a political energy, but it was absolutely not democratic. It did not believe that power should go to the masses. Now, one thing that modern Trumpism is keying into is a basic idea that you don't trickle down progress from the top to the bottom, but that the ruling elites are so out of touch with the needs and worldviews and desires of the people that the people have to take over the deep state, this alien force that the state has become. So populism can be interpreted as an attempt to re-democratize, in the sense of demos, of people, to re-democratize a liberal democracy which has lost touch with the people. So there are all sorts of ways of constituting this. But my point is, I think a much more effective starting point for looking at people like Trump or Modi or Erdogan, or all these people who operate within societies with elections, is to talk about the retreat of liberalism, the attempt to demonize liberalism. So it gets demonized as sort of nanny state, or it gets demonized as political correctness, or it gets demonized as being wishy-washy. Democrats, there's a whole language within the Republican right for delegitimizing liberal Democrats and the judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's much more interesting to look at the deliberalization of democracy than to keep seeing that in terms of fascism.
Let's talk about the role of the public here. As you know, Ian Kershaw, the great scholar of Hitler and the Third Reich, I'm not sure if he coined the term popular dictatorship, but he certainly advanced it and worked on it in his books. Revolutionary populist impulses, the organic community. It's not traditional authoritarianism, if you will, where you just have edicts from on high and you want a quiescent public. You want a mobilized, well, of course, it's an exclusionary community. In Nazi Germany, Jews and others were not allowed to be part of the organic community. But we've all seen those photos of, arenas or stadiums filled with 100,000 people all standing ramrod straight with their arms outstretched, Heil Hitler, right? That organic community, what Hitler wanted there, that's not what we're seeing here in the United States with.
No, it's very interesting. People should actually, and it's on the web, have a look at the rally of the silver shirts in I think it was Madison Gardens, is that in New York?
Madison
Just in
Square Garden.
1939. Madison Square Garden, 1939. They should look at that. If you want to see real American fascism, which was minute in terms of support, have a look at that. It's a real rally. That is a fascist rally where it's regimented. It's not people whooping and wearing idiosyncratic badges and stuff like that. It's not a Trump crowd. There's a huge difference between a Trump crowd, a Trump rally, and a fascist rally. And if you want to take the extreme, of course, you take the Nuremberg rally. I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that if the purpose is to try and make sense of the present, then to grab at the word fascism, it's a starting point if we move beyond it. But if you stick with it, it becomes a cul-de-sac. It blinds you to the big differences between now and the war period. But it also blinds us to much bigger processes at work. Now, I've made up a few terms in my career, and this week I made up another one. And I did because I had to give a talk to some sixth formers, which I'm giving on Tuesday, about this sort of topic, about how useful is the word fascism to make sense of the modern world. You know, is China fascist? Is Modi fascist, etc.? I found myself lacking a word to explain the big process that I think is taking place. And this is a process by which nations within whatever culture they've got, political or religious, are turning in on themselves. In America, it's called isolationism, which is quite a specific and historical concept. But what about Islam actually breeding people who say Islam is the only true faith and fight a war against non-Islamic nations? And because they believe that their nation is being threatened by alien forces, or Putin being partly influenced by a thing called Eurasianism, which talks about the uniqueness of the Russian people, or China persecuting Uyghur Muslims because they don't fit in, or Myanmar Buddhists even attacking Muslims. What is this? Xenophobia, this idea of a single group within your nation that represents the true people all over the world, not just in liberal democracy. And so I wanted a sort of name for the process by which nations shed their openness, their what I call centripetal forces, this moving out to the rest of the world, globalization, joining international foundations, thriving on cultural interactions with other nations, that sort of outward movement. I didn't have a word for it, so I made one up. And I found this wonderful theological expression, incurvus per se, which means curved in on oneself. And the definition in Christian theology, and this goes back to the Middle Ages, it's a bad, evil state of mind to be curvus in se, because it cuts off your ability to care about God and other people. Now, your God could be any God you like. But this idea that this state of mind cuts off your empathy with people from other races, people in other nations, migrants, Muslims or Christians or whatever, Israeli right-wingers cut off from their ability to respond to Palestinians as people, Palestinian extremists wanting to wipe out the Jewish nation. This is, it seems to me, a global process. All over the world, you can take any country you like, even Sweden, which was identical with liberal democracy and free love and good modern furniture, etc., has got its own very strong populist, anti-migrant, anti-humanist movement. So I want to introduce the academic world on this podcast for the first time in world history, a word which will probably die a death, and it's called incurvation. A nation curves in back on itself. They say in French, replier sur soi-même. Once you become psychologically turned in on oneself, then a whole load of things that Trump or Putin or Modi, if you're a Hindu Indian and you've got a populist figure who tells you that you're only really Indian if you're Hindu, and therefore all these Muslims and Sikhs and all these people, they're not real, they're not true Indians. If you're a Mexican American, or even if you're an Afro-American, you're not a true American. This idea that there's an essential true member of your community.
You see that in Hungary as well, yeah.
Absolutely. Incurvation. If you're Hungarian, then Jews and Sinti and Roma, but even why does Orban support Putin? Because for historical reasons, but also because he sees in Putin a parallel figure to his own attempt to Hungarianize Hungary. and Trump is Americanizing America, blah, blah, blah. So
Incurvation, how do you spell that?
well, curve, it's the same word as curve. You are curved in on yourself. So I'm going to try and flog this word. I'm sure it won't work. But I'm talking about a global phenomenon of incurvation, national, psychological, communal, religious incurvation. And what this means is that any sense of the common humanity of everybody is under threat. And what you then see is that in country after country, roughly half of the voting population is curved in on itself, is xenophobic, is frightened about transgender experimentation and second and third generation migrant offspring and big institutions like United Nations or the International Court. Look at Netanyahu's response to the Hague verdict on the charge brought by South Africa that they are committing genocide in, or any possibility that your own state is committing terror in order to fight terror. Rather than try to, in our minds, make the current state of the world, which is so chaotic and so in need of some sort of diagnosis, to fit in the template of fascism or Nazism or even just totalitarianism or whatever. I don't find any of those isms, they're all too specific to fit what's going on in, say, Myanmar and in Iran and in Afghanistan and in America and in Russia and in China, etc., etc. So I like this fact that St. Augustine used this phrase in Latin, incurvatus in se, and the word incurvation is used in medicine for a birth defect where the spine is too curved in on itself. But I'm taking this as a state of mind, and I think what we're witnessing in different permutations throughout the world is a real split between those people in a population who almost by nature and by temperament are open to otherness, who are actually drawn to otherness, and those who actually feel threatened by otherness and who demonize otherness by creating categories which are exclusive. And so I think that split, if you look at it in terms of ideology, is at the heart of American politics between the best Democrat thinkers and the best Republican thinkers. I'm not talking about Trump. I don't count him as a thinker. But there are some articulate Republican critiques of liberal democracy, which I accept. You know, I accept that it is a coherent position. I don't think Trump has a coherent position, but that the world process which is shaping our future now is this underground war going on between two ideological and temperamental and psychological responses to the state of the world. One is to be alarmed and seek greater unity between human beings and human cultures, irrespective of their differences. And the other is to highlight difference and to want to turn in on oneself and create an idealized community based on what are meant to be the true representatives of your own nation or culture or religion. And I think this is the greatest danger to humanity, because we've also got to face a demographic and an ecological crisis, which I cannot see how it can be confronted in a world divided almost equally between two types of citizen, the people who are drawn to otherness and the people who are repelled by it.
Well, many modern problems like climate change require international cooperation, not nationalism and retrenchment, or as you say, incurvation, or maybe incurvationism. So that's not a political ideology per se, but
it's not an ideology, but it's this mindset that informs an ideology.
Yeah, and as I was listening to you, Roger, what you're explaining here sounds a lot like, well, competing nationalisms. This isn't new. Most of human experience has not been under liberal democracy, only part of the 20th century. What's causing this to all happen now? We try to find, larger impersonal forces, the so-called wind of change that blew across Eastern Europe in the late 1980s that, freed all those Eastern European countries. What happened? What caused that? It wasn't impersonal force.
These are mysterious things.
It's hard. It's hard to pin. But let me just finish my point here. You look at Orban, Xi, the Ayatollahs in Iran, Trump, Putin, they don't have a lot in common other than that they're quote-unquote strongmen. They don't really seem to have a coherent, shared critique of liberalism, or maybe they do. So I guess I'm at a loss here, but I agree with you. We need a new lexicon.
But I would actually argue there is this deep link between, say, an Ayatollah or an Afghan male chauvinist who wants to take women out of society. I mean, fear of change, fear of the blurring of categories, fear of hybridity, of messiness of the modern world, a sense of the threat to tradition. I mean, when you see a mosque with a satellite dish on the side of it, for some people that's brilliant because people can actually worship Allah in their rooms on the web, But for some people, this is a very profound threat. And I think that we're dealing here with fundamental reactions to the world. If I come from a family which was full of Brexiteers, there was no dialogue between us. I mean, I'm married to an Italian. I've learnt different languages. I love going to different places. I even quite like the airport as a sort of portal, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of otherness, the idea of embracing it and learning its language and enjoying its culture and its food, and the fact that people do things differently, that turns me on. And some people, and it's not to do with intelligence or human qualities, but they literally, at a very deep psychological level, they feel threatened. They feel existentially threatened by a world they can't understand or a world that's changing. And I think that what we got after the Second World War with the new generation that I lived through of the hippies and the early 60s up to the Manson, we had this extraordinary movement among young people think, yeah, we can do this differently. It was a sort of cultural revolution. And then that went wrong. And then we had, Reaganomics and Thatcher, I'm talking from a Western experience. Yeah. And then we had this new little bit where the East Bloc melted and a whole load of people felt liberated by that. But the dream keeps turning into a nightmare. One of the great drivers of Nazism was the catastrophic psychological impact of the collapse of the German economy in 1929, which was a repercussion of the massive loans taken out from America when they were all called in 1929 as a result of the Depression, combined with the hyperinflation of 23 and the defeat in the First World War. These were a series of blows to identity. Here we hit identity. That by 1929, anybody with savings had lost all their savings. There was a general sense of crisis in what it was to be German and what Germany was. And the myth of Germany had been shattered. And you either grabbed the Russian Revolution solution of becoming a communist and saying this is part of the collapse of capitalism and let's fight for workers and ordinary people and create an international, or there was the Hitler solution, which was to say, follow me and I will make your country great again and you will know what it is to be German and I will tell you why all these terrible things are happening. It's the Jews and it's the Americans, et cetera, et cetera. And so those people who could not live with chaos and not knowing had these two wonderful opposite narratives to lock into. And what Hitler represented was a massive incurvation of the national psyche, which meant that you suddenly saw the world exclusively through the lens of being German, defined in racial, biological, historical, Aryan terms. So my point is, rather than apply Nazism like Biden does to Trump rather loosely and say that the concept of Nazism helps explain Trump, we can look at the rise of Trumpism and Putism now and get more of a handle on what drove fascism in the interwar period. It's the existential insecurity. It's the loss of identity. It's the loss of a sense of future. It's the loss of a simple narrative. Yeah. And what people like Trump and Putin give their populations is a narrative because most people fear chaos and confusion and a sense of anomie.
Yeah, Putin promised simple state patriotism, reviving Russia's greatness. And there is a parallel there when you mention how Germans lost all their savings. 1990s Russia was a catastrophe for ordinary people.
That was like Weimar.
Yes.
That was like Weimar after 1929. Yeah.
People lost everything while the oligarchs made out like bandits. There's something else we're seeing here in this incurvation. It's a reaction to false...
You're the first other person in the world ever to use that term, and it probably probably the last.
Yes.
Okay?
Well, I like palingenesis better because no one really knows what that means.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing here, too, is a reaction to the excessive optimism that greeted the end of the Cold War in the 1990s.
Absolutely. The end of history myth. Yeah.
Global capitalism.
You remember the peace dividend? We were all going to get richer.
Well, we did actually cut in the United States, amazingly. We did reduce defense spending for a short time.
So did we.
Yeah.
And now we're being told to increase it again.
That's right. Well, it's gone in the other direction tenfold. But the point here is the promises made about, and I just did an episode about this with Nelson Lichtenstein, a labor historian, about the Clinton economy and the transformation of American, really global capitalism. The promises made about free trade, how it would help American workers, all the good stuff that was promised without paying enough attention to the possible negative consequences that have come true. And also something else here, a belief in technology, the ability of technological innovation to solve almost any societal problem, had a way of discrediting, and of course we're coming on the heels of the Reagan era here in the 1990s, discrediting the ability of the government, your government, to do anything right. And I do think in part of this incurvation, we're seeing people react against the establishment. Maybe in Europe, it's the EU. Here in the United States, it's the federal government. So it becomes self-fulfilling. I know this is kind of a long point here, Roger, but I know you can hang in there. We were told we didn't need government all that much. So why would anyone today look to the government to solve anything when they've been basically a generation or two feeling deep alienation toward their own government?
Well, that's the key word, you see, alienation. Once you start, Germans in 1929, waking up in the morning, looking at the newspapers, looking in the streets, and not recognizing yourself in your environment, in your country, in the people who represent you, in your leaders, feeling this sense of alienation, dissociation from your reality, and somebody comes along with a narrative that explains it, deep state, fake news, it's the liberal left, it's the, then people like, not everybody, I think the big temperamental difference between, say, liberal democratic cultural journalists, of which there are some brilliant ones in America, is a taste for complexity, a taste for dismantling narratives and probing beyond the version you're getting. I mean, I think the most fundamental brilliance of Trump, if he was brilliant enough to be brilliant, is the dissemination of the concept of fake. The idea that you don't disprove or dismantle your opponent's position. You just say it's all fake, it's all contaminated. Don't even listen to it, because the institution that's produced this individual is unreliable. You don't even have to engage with it. And in fact, the more they bring out their truth, the more it proves I'm right. Like, the more people who prove that there was no cheating in the elections, it more proves there was a cheat.
Demolishing faith. Yeah, demolishing all faith in any and all public institutions.
In experts, in language, in rationality, in processes, in procedures, in the judiciary.
But here's the thing, Roger, and you know this, of course. American institutions have failed.
Well, now we hit a very deep thing, which is actually liberal democracy is a utopia. Social democracy in Nordic countries, most liberal Democrats would agree with me if you actually study the functioning of democracy in terms of its liberal potential. The only little part of the world where you have functioning liberal democracy as a sort of utopia, and even there are problems, is Scandinavia. If you look at old folks' homes, the way the health system works, the way the educational system works, the way the transport system works, the way the environment is cared for, the way women are treated, the way children are treated, the care arrangements, the paternity leaves, a whole load of criteria. It's not a paradise. The correlation between work, effort, and reward, the limitation of the pay of a CEO compared with the lowest worker. All these things are just taken for granted. That in social democracy, as opposed to liberal democracy, there is a model in Scandinavia for the sort of society I thought Britain was heading towards, and I don't think America could never have headed towards, because of the cult of personal success. There is a cult of success in American psyche, which I find an admiration of wealth and of success in material terms, which is part of my myth of America, if you like, which I think is so endemic. You do not find that in Scandinavia. It's quite extraordinary. one of the great tragedies of modern history is that the liberal turn instead of the social turn in the French Revolution. At the height of the chaos of the early 1790s, there was a Jacobin side cutting people's heads off with guillotines. There was an incredible fragmentation of French revolutionary politics into about 20 or 30 different factions. And one of those was called the Society of Equals, led by a guy called Babeuf. And there you have the first formulation of what we now recognize to be socialism, not communism, socialism. And at that point, there was a potential for a far more matriarchal view of society, socialism, workers' rights, a whole load of things. And tragically, with the rise of Napoleon and the hostility of Europe to the French Revolution and the way it all ended up with war and Napoleon and reaction and restoration, etc., that social democratic potential of the French Revolution was lost. Within a couple of decades, revolution meant bourgeois, the rise of a bourgeoisie. And that's exactly what happened in America and Britain. By the end of the 19th century, you have the industrial bourgeoisie and you have an exploited working force. And it then took labor politics to try and redress that. But in a way, in the 1790s, this potential pathway towards Scandinavian-style social democracy was lost. And I think there is something deeply wrong with modern liberal democracy, but it's not going to be corrected by the right or the populist right, which is only going to make it worse.
It all comes back to the French Revolution, doesn't it?
No, it goes back further. In the
that was a joke, Roger.
Century, I know, but I thought I'd react to it with a typical academic way. Yeah. There are two major mythic figures for me in the 17th century, Hobbes and Locke. And Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan. He said that human nature was so competitive and evil and mendacious and greedy, etc. You needed a massive, great big authoritarian state to keep everybody in their place. No individual human rights, no right to anything really. You have this thing called the Leviathan, which is a name taken from the Bible. It means a monster. So you have the monster state in order to create rights, law and order especially. And that, of course, needs strong individuals. So you have the idea of the strong state. And within 20 years, Locke, he'd formulated a liberal theory of government, which was based on optimism about human nature and an optimism about the capacity of human beings collectively to progress towards a society based on equality and rights. In a way, what's happening with populism is that the Hobbesian idea, the idea that the state, even though it speaks the language of populism and appeals to the masses, is actually treads on people's rights, treads on the rights of others, treads on any sort of United Nations vision of humanity, and actually ends up being a strong state, like you get with Putin. Putin's the archetypal Hobbesian. And if you want to go back even further, Plato's Republic is extraordinary. Plato had this vision of a republic where you actually had people forced to believe a myth of society, which divided it into gold, silver, and bronze. Three different classes, the rich elite, the middle classes, and the masses. And they were taught to believe that it was necessarily so. Basically, the republic would have been a sort of autocratic state where people believed they were free, but they were actually not free because they were trapped within a myth of the natural divisions and natural inequalities of society. And I think that if you read The Republic and the Leviathan, you realize that a lot of modern states, China, North Korea, etc., are based on a vision of democracy as being equated with chaos, breakdown of society, hedonistic individualism, no rules, no law and order, utter chaos. Human beings need a strong government with power to crush freedom of thought, freedom of morality, etc., for their own good. And so in a way, what we're living through, and this is just to jumble up our ideal types, our stereotypes, is a conflict between a sort of Hobbesian and Lockean view of society. And broadly speaking, liberal Democrats are on the side of Locke. And de facto, the Trumpists and the far right of the Republicans and the Putinists and the Xingians in China, etc., are on the side of this Hobbesian view that the state cannot afford, and certainly Hitler and Mussolini cannot afford, to have liberal individualism, human rights, freedom of thought, etc., genuine competition, because it will just degenerate back into a primitive state. I find myself increasingly not even bothering to talk about politics with anybody, because either people are with me. I mean, the talisman in England is whether you're Brexiteer or not. The anti-Brexiteers in England are filled with a sense of absolute tragedy and self-destruction, whereas the Brexiteers still have this delusion that we have gained this mythical thing called sovereignty and that everything is better now because we're no longer, quote, ruled by Brussels. And these are deep-seated psychological types responding to existential crisis. And unfortunately, the modern world is generating no end of threats to a sense of stable identity and future.
It's a good way of looking at it. I do think Donald Trump's most ardent supporters, and that's not everyone who's going to vote for him. Some people are just going to vote for him because he's a Republican and they don't want another Democratic administration. But for his most ardent supporters, it's not about policy. He has a deep, as you say, psychological connection to people.
He targets groups, the threats to society, the liberal press. He holds back from anti-Semitism. In the interwar period, I think he might have been an anti-Semite, but he certainly demonizes entire groups of people. And what is terrifying is, in a way, to be a Democrat now, thanks to Trump, in the minds of millions of people in America, is to be identified with electoral fraud, a sort of perverse delight in America's decline, and the idea of opening the floodgates to immigration and trashing the society, abortions, and a whole load of amazing things have been clustered together
and
to
Republicans,
create this sort of
too.
hate figure.
And Republicans. He bashes Republicans as much as he bashes Democrats.
Well, actually, the healthy, if you like, the intelligent American Republican tradition is the defensible interpretation of the needs of the nation. I mean, there is a respectable way of being a Republican, and there's certainly a disrespectful or an unrespectable way of being a Democrat. But at its best, American politics, well, these are bright human beings who see problems as complex and who have to make pragmatic decisions. And in a way, there's a meeting ground between the most intelligent and humanistic left and right politicians in every country. They have more in common than the extremes on both sides of the spectrum.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, if you think we're having heated debates over free speech today, wait till you learn what happened in Skokie, Illinois in the late 1970s. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.